Number 3. Robby, Floyd, Jennifer Hughes, Sarena Glenn, Brent Hughes, and Brenttany Hughes. In the winter of 1996, 32-year-old Robby Floyd lived in Fayetteville, North Carolina with her third husband, Jason, their child Brandon, and 3 of her children from previous relationships, 11-year-old Sarena Glenn and a pair of 4-year-old twins, Brent Hughes and Brenttany Hughes. Sometime in December, a neighbor of the family noticed Robby loading boxes into her blue van. She was with her sister, 17-year-old Jennifer Hughes, and an older woman. Robby told the neighbor that the older woman was her mother. Robby was in a rush, and she told her neighbor that she was going to Alabama. She said her father was sick, and she was going to see him. She then loaded 3 of her 4 children into the van, 11-year-old Sarena and her 4-year-old twins, Brent and Brenttany. Then Robby and her sister Jennifer got into the van, and they drove off. Her neighbor never saw them again. Robby didn't keep in close contact with her family, and she was known to go voluntarily missing for long periods of time. As a result, her family didn't report her missing until a year and a half later, in August 1998. Robby's family in Sylacauga, Alabama, said that Robby did plan to move back to help with her ailing father, but she never arrived. They said they had not talked to or seen her since December 1996. On the last day that Robby was seen, she was seen with an older woman. Robby introduced the woman to her neighbor as her mother. But Robby's mother said she had not been to her daughter's house for several years before she went missing. Robby's father died in 1998, and she didn't come to the funeral. During their investigation, the police talked to Robby's neighbors. They learned that Robby's husband, Jason, and the one child she left behind, who was the only child she had with Jason, continued to live in the house where he lived with Robby and her kids for about 2 months after they disappeared. Then in February 1997, they moved away. The neighbors also told the police that Robby and Jason had been having marital problems. Before she went missing, they had been separated, and the neighbors said that Robby told her that they were talking about getting divorced. However, it appeared that they had reconciled before she, her 3 kids, and her sister went missing. The police tracked Jason down, and he said that he talked to Robby after she left North Carolina. She told him that she was calling from a motel near her parents' house in Sylacauga, Alabama. She said she would phone again in a few days, but he never heard from her again. The police eventually cleared Jason as a suspect in the disappearance of Robby, her sister Jennifer, and Robby's 3 children. Then in 2004, a detective who worked on the mass disappearance told the newspaper, the Fayetteville Observer, that the family wasn't actually missing. He said on the day that Robby drove off with her sister and her 3 children, the sheriff's department was coming to arrest her for writing bad checks. Robby had been writing checks using 14 different aliases. The detective said that Robby ultimately settled in Alabama. Supposedly, in 1999, she set up an address there. The detective told the newspaper that after he tracked Robby down to Alabama, he turned the file over to the Alabama Bureau of Investigation. He considered the case closed. Then, in 2011, another article about the mass disappearance was published. In the article, the families of Robby, Jennifer, Sarena, Brent, and Brenttany refuted much of what the detective told the newspaper in 2004. The family members pointed out that no one has heard from them since December 1996, and none of their social security numbers have been used in the years since they went missing. A lieutenant with the sheriff's department verified the claims. He said that none of their social security numbers were used, and no schools have asked for the kids' records. Also, the twins, Brent and Brenttany, who were 4 when they went missing, had a heart condition and they needed medication. But there are no records of the twins seeing a doctor or visiting a hospital in the years since they went missing. The lieutenant with the sheriff's department said it was as if they don't exist anymore. Serena's father, Jerry Glenn, said, "My gut feeling tells me something's not right. Just for 5 people coming up missing doesn't sound good from the start." If the 5 family members are still alive today, Robby would be 54 and her sister Jennifer would be 39. Robby's daughter, Sarena, would be 33 and her twins, Brent and Brenttany, would be 26. Number 2, Diego Garcia, Carmen Burhans, and Barbara Burhans. In March 1982, 40-year-old Carmen Burhans lived with her husband, 28-year-old Diego Garcia, and their 8-year-old daughter, Barbara, in a house in the Glassell Park area of Los Angeles, California. Carmen's mother, Margaret Roman, lived in an apartment in the basement of the family's house. Diego was unemployed, and Carmen supported the family by working at an insurance brokerage. On March 15, 1982, Margaret came up from her apartment to visit her daughter and her family while they ate breakfast. Margaret noticed that Carmen had been crying, but she didn't ask why. Several hours later, at around noon, the family drove off in their brown 1977 Toyota Corolla. Sadly, they never returned home. After a couple of days, Margaret reported them missing. The police were instantly baffled by the disappearance of the family. The obvious answer was that the family skipped town for some reason. The lead detective on the case, John Carroll, said that one rumor he heard was that Diego had gambling debts and the family moved to Little Havana in Miami, Florida. One problem with that rumor was that the family didn't take their clothes, their luggage, or any of their possessions with them. They even left their dog behind. On April 27th, about a month and a half after the family was last seen, their car was found. It was covered in snow 500 feet down in a gorge in the San Gabriel Mountains, about 70 miles from their home. There was no blood or signs of trauma inside the car. The gorge was searched, but besides their car, no trace of the family was found. Detective Carroll said that it doesn't appear that the family was in the car when it went down into the gorge. Instead, he thinks that someone pushed the car into the gorge. The road where the car went down into the gorge had been closed since March 16th, the day after the family went missing. Detective Carroll said it was possible that the car was pushed into the gorge by someone who was trying to get rid of the car. He said that another possibility is that the car was parked on the side of the road and it was knocked into the gorge by accident by a snowplow. One reason the family could have abandoned the car was because they were having problems with the car. But no one in the area remembered seeing the family, nor did anyone remember a family looking for help with their car around the time that the family went missing. Carmen's mother, Margaret, told Detective Carroll that shortly before the family went missing, Carmen had converted to Mormonism. She also said that Carmen may have been involved in a cult that used candles and killed chickens as sacrifices. Detective Carroll looked at the family's bank accounts, and 5 days after they went missing, a check from Carmen's bank account was cashed. It was cashed by an elderly woman who owned a chicken ranch in Santa Clarita, California. The woman told Detective Carroll that she sold Carmen some live chickens before she went missing. Detective Carroll cannot confirm if Carmen was involved in a cult, and he didn't know if her religious practices were connected to her family's disappearance. After the family went missing, Carmen's mother started getting strange phone calls. Most of the time, the caller would just hang up when she answered. Then one time, the caller told Margaret that the family had been killed because Carmen didn't come up with enough money to cover a debt that Diego owed. The next day, there was another phone call. This caller said they saw Carmen walking down the road in a white dress. None of the calls were traced, and the identity of the callers remains a mystery. The caller wasn't the only person who supposedly saw Carmen after she went missing. A high school friend of Carmen said that she saw Carmen at a shopping plaza in Los Angeles. Another person supposedly saw her at a hospital. The witness said she was with an elderly woman and they were buying flowers. Then finally, in mid-April, about a month after the family went missing, the owner of a candle store said that Carmen came in and bought some candles. Detective Carroll couldn't confirm any of the sightings. He thinks that the family had their car stolen or they were victims of a carjacking. He said it's entirely possible they were killed for their car. Then the killer got rid of the car by pushing it into the gorge on the closed road. But since the family hasn't been found, Detective Carroll hasn't been able to confirm any of the theories about what happened to them. He said the only thing he knew for sure was that the family was still missing. Over 36 years later, besides their car, no trace of Carmen, Diego, or Barbara has ever been found. Number 1. The Clinton Avenue 5. August 20th, 1978 was a humid, overcast day in Newark, New Jersey. That afternoon, 17-year-olds Melvin Pittman and Ernest Taylor and 16-year-olds Alvin Turner, Michael McDowell, and Randy Johnson were playing basketball at Westside Park. As they played, a mutual friend named Lee Evans, who worked as a mason and a carpenter, asked the 5 young men if they wanted to make some money by moving some boxes. The young men agreed, and they arranged to meet up later that evening. At least 3 of the young men went home for dinner, and then they returned to the park. At 9:30 p.m., Michael McDowell returned home for a few minutes. He got a drink of water and changed his clothes. He then left his house and got into the back of Evan's pickup truck. Evan's pickup truck, with at least 2 of the young men in the back, was seen at 10 p.m. at an intersection near the boys' homes. After that sighting, the 5 teenagers seemingly vanished into thin air. Their families reported them missing, but the police didn't do much in the way of investigating. They just assumed the 5 teenagers had run away and they would get in contact with their families any day. A few days after the teens went missing, Randy Johnson's mother, Sarah, received a phone call. The caller demanded $750 in exchange for information about what happened to her son. Sarah reported the call to the police and they traced it. The call came from a payphone at Union Station in Washington, D.C., which is over 200 miles from Newark. The police thought it was one of the teens who were looking to get money to fund their excursion. But the caller never phoned back and never attempted to collect the money. After a few weeks, the young men still hadn't returned home, and the police began to think it was possible that they met with foul play. The most obvious suspect was Lee Evans, the man the 5 teens were last seen with. Evans swore he had nothing to do with the disappearance of the young men. He said he dropped them off at an intersection near their homes at around 10 p.m., and that was the last time he saw them. The police asked him to take a polygraph exam, and he agreed. He was asked if he had anything to do with the young man's disappearance, and he said he didn't. The polygraph examiner determined that he was telling the truth. Nevertheless, the police started trailing Evans, hoping that he'd do something to implicate himself or give some clue to the whereabouts of the 5 teens. Then 3 months after the young men vanished, shocking news emerged from Guyana, a country in northern South America, and it gave the police their first possible lead in months. On November 15, 1978, California Representative Leo Ryan and a delegation of 18 people flew to Guyana to visit Jonestown. Jonestown was a commune established by religious leader Jim Jones for his church, the People's Temple. Ryan was visiting Jonestown on the behalf of relatives of church members who thought that the church members were being held in Jonestown against their will. 3 days after arriving, Ryan, his delegation, and 16 People's Temple defectors traveled to an airstrip about 6 miles from Jonestown. At the airstrip, some members of the People's Temple opened fire on the group. Ryan and 4 other people were killed at the airstrip, and 6 people were injured. Back at Jonestown, 47-year-old Jim Jones told his followers that there was no hope. He said the American government was going to break up the church. He told his followers that their last act of defiance was to kill themselves by drinking some cyanide-laced flavor aid. Parents were told to make their children drink the poison first, and then they were to ingest it. If someone refused to drink the poison, he or she were restrained and injected with cyanide. As many as 70 people were forcefully injected. After his congregation was dead, Jones shot himself in the temple. In total, 918 people died that day. 304 of them were minors. Only 85 people survived. Unfortunately, many of the bodies, especially those of minors, could not be identified. The police thought it was possible that the Clinton Avenue 5, as they came to be called, died at Jonestown. But they never found any evidence that the teens had contact with the People's Temple, nor did they find any evidence that they left the United States or arrived in Guyana. While the police considered it possible that the teens died in Jonestown, they thought it was more likely that Lee Evans was involved in the mass disappearance. But in the years after the young men went missing, Evans didn't act suspicious, and they didn't find any evidence that connected him to the mass disappearance. Evans maintained his innocence, and he never moved away from the area. Then in 2008, 30 years after the Clinton Avenue 5 vanished, the police began to reinvestigate the mass disappearance. After several months, they thought they had cracked the case. In November 2008, the detectives working on the case interviewed Lee Evans' cousin, 51-year-old Philander Hampton. After 13 hours, Hampton confessed to being involved in the murder of the teens. He said that Evans wanted to kill them because they had stolen a pound of marijuana from him. First, they picked up 2 of the teenagers, and then they took them to an abandoned house where Hampton used to squat and sell drugs out of. Hampton said he was armed with a gun, and he watched the 2 young men while Evans went out to get the other 3 teens. Hampton said that when Evans returned to the abandoned house with the other 3 teens, he forced the 5 young men into a closet that was 4 feet by 2 feet. Then Evans took a single nail and he nailed the closet door shut. He then doused the closet door and the area in front of the closet in gasoline. Supposedly, he asked Hampton for a match. Hampton said he gave him a match and then he walked out of the abandoned house. Hampton said that later, he saw that the house was on fire. The police looked in the records, and it turned out that the house Hampton was talking about did burn down the same night that the young man disappeared. However, no traces of their body were found in the wreckage. 30 years later, a new house stood in place of the burned wreckage. The police used ground-penetrating radar to see if they could find any trace of the young men, like a tooth or a bone shard, but they found absolutely no evidence that the young men were burned alive there. Despite having no physical evidence, in March 2011, Hampton and Evans were charged with murder. The prosecution's case was that Evans was the last person seen with the 5 young men, and Hampton's confession. In November 2011, Evans went to trial, and he acted as his own attorney. He pleaded not guilty. Hampton made a plea deal with the district attorney, and he testified against Evans. On the stand, he repeated the same story he told the police. He testified that Evans used a single nail to lock the 5 young men in the closet, and then he set the house on fire. Evans' court-appointed legal advisor did the cross-examination of Hampton. During the cross-examination, Hampton testified that when he confessed to the police, he had been talking to them for 13 straight hours. He also said that in exchange for testifying, he was given a 10-year sentence, but he would be allowed to apply for parole after serving just 6 months. When he was released, the district attorney's office was going to pay him $15,000 for relocation fees. Hampton also admitted that he had been a heroin addict for 10 years and he sold drugs. He was in and out of prison for most of his adult life. This included a 10-year sentence for a pair of armed robberies. Evans' legal advisor even questioned the plausibility of Hampton's confession. For example, would 5 teenage boys be able to fit into a closet that was 4x2? Would a single nail be strong enough to keep the door closed? Or would 5 athletic young men be able to break down the door? Also, Hampton was a small guy, and the teens were all larger than him. When he was watching 2 of the teenagers, why didn't they try to overpower him and take the gun? Finally, if the young men did die in the fire, wouldn't someone have found a trace of them when the wreckage of the fire was cleaned up? Or when the police searched the area with ground-penetrating radar? The jury ended up deliberating for more than 12 hours. They found Evans not guilty on all charges. At the time of this video, the case of the Clinton Avenue 5 remains unresolved. Even if Lee Evans was involved in the mass disappearance, he'll never be retried. He maintains his innocence, and no evidence links him to the disappearance of the 5 young men. Evans said that being accused and tried for such a horrible crime was devastating. He said, "That's not the same thing as someone destroying you. It's like someone put you in the oven and burned you up. You can't undo that." No trace of Melvin Pittman, Ernest Taylor, Alvin Turner, Michael McDowell, and Randy Johnson has ever been found. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Hopefully you found it interesting. If you did, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos just like it. Also, please go to criminallylisted.com where you can suggest cases, buy merch, and find out about an exclusive podcast. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.